The Iron Age in Britain. It spanned from roughly 800 BCE until the Romans arrived in 43 CE, a period where communities lived without written records, but left a bit of evidence through archaeology and the accounts of classical observers. This was a world of small villages, farms, hill forts, one where people depended on the land and their livestock for survival. Far from being a time of unrelenting hardship, Iron Age Britain saw craftspeople, skilled farmers, and warriors thrive in a landscape dotted with forests, fields, and sacred groves. And so the purpose of our time together today is to open a window into those everyday experiences of the ancient Britons. It's all about things like how they worked, what they ate, the clothes they wore, the homes they lived in, how they worshipped, and ultimately how they understood their world. Like we said, we don't have any written records, at least not from the Britons, but from a combination of archaeological findings and a few points of view from Greek and Roman chroniclers, we can get a pretty good idea of what things were like, the daily life of Iron Age British people. And so before we go back in time, allow me to welcome you to the channel. Hello to any newcomers, and welcome back to anybody coming back. It's good to have you with me again. Of course, if you're not familiar with the typical introduction, we do begin it by thanking those who keep the channel completely ad-free. Those are those great people supporting on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the occasional donation, and those who are browsing the merch store from time to time, with all little goodies on there. All links available in the description. But short of that, just give us a like, subscribe, a bit of a comment for the algorithm, and tell your friends. Always helps. In any case, enjoy your time here. That's what it's all about. Now, we've said it once, we won't say it again. Let's begin our journey back to Iron Age Britain. Of course, we begin by saying that in general it was overwhelmingly rural. You're not going to find the big cities like you would in the Near East and Mesopotamia in Britain at this time, that's for sure. Most people lived in small farming communities scattered across the countryside. A typical settlement consisted of a cluster of roundhouses, circular dwellings constructed from local materials. These houses had stout wooden posts forming their frame, walls made of wattle and daub. If you don't know what that is, by the way, it's kind of like a woven wood plastered with clay and mud. And of course, conical thatched roofs of straw or heather. The roundhouses were often about 5 to 10 meters in diameter, spacious enough for an extended family to live together in a single room. Archaeological excavations reveal packed earth floors sometimes covered with clay, with a central fire pit or hearth that served for cooking, heating, and light. There was usually no chimney. Smoke from the hearth filtered out through the thatch, giving the interior a smoky aroma, sure, but also helping to dry and preserve food and hides hung from the rafters. Inside an Iron Age roundhouse, life was communal and centered on the hearth. By the glow of the fire, family members cooked porridge or stew in clay pots, or even iron cauldrons, and baked flatbreads on heated stones. They slept on simple beds or piles of straw and animal furs arranged around the walls. Furnishings were minimal, but they were functional. Wooden stools, woven baskets, and pottery storage jars for grain and water. You might even find a cairnstone set on the floor for grinding grain, or perhaps a loom for weaving near the wall, showing how the work and domestic life intertwined in the same space. But despite the lack of windows, only the smoke hole and the open doorway provided light. These houses could be surprisingly warm and comfortable. They've even recreated many of them in modern times, and, well, surprisingly, they stand up pretty well. Well-built thatch is waterproof, and not to mention insulating. And archaeological evidence, such as at sites preserved in waterlogged conditions, has even shown that Iron Age people used finely crafted wooden bowls, textiles, and furniture. A touch of cozy domesticity in their homes. Settlements were usually farmsteads or hamlets rather than large towns. A few families might live in a cluster of roundhouses, surrounded by their fields and pastures. In some regions, particularly in the later Iron Age, larger enclosed villages or oppida began to develop, especially in the more populous and fertile areas of the southeast. But for most of the Iron Age, the population was spread out. For protection and community gatherings, people sometimes built hill forts, large fortified sites on hilltops or ridges, encircled by earthwork ramparts and ditches. These hill forts, just for one example, the impressive Maiden Castle in Dorset or the Treachery in Wales, contained many roundhouses within their defences. Some may have seasonally occupied refuges or strongholds in times of danger, while others were continuous settlements and political centres for local tribes. But even those who lived outside the hill forts likely used them as a place for periodic markets, festivals, or taking shelter during raids. The landscape of Iron Age Britain was dotted with these small farmsteads and occasional hill fort communities. Fields were typically demarcated by hedges or ditches, and livestock enclosures and granary pits were common features near the dwellings. The lack of urban centres didn't necessarily mean isolation either. Paths and trackways linked farm to farm, and rivers served as natural highways. The people of one village knew their neighbours in the next valley, and regional meeting places would draw communities together from time to time. Overall, the home and settlement formed the heart of this daily life. In these roundhouses, warm, smoky, and alive with family activity, generations of Britons were born, laboured, they told stories, and eventually passed away, leaving behind only traces in the soil and fragments of their pottery to mark centuries of a quiet and simple domestic existence. The backbone of daily life in Iron Age Britain was certainly agriculture. The majority of people were farmers who cultivated crops and raised animals, producing most of what their families needed. Fields of wheat and barley surrounded the settlements, and grain was truly the staff of life. Iron Age farmers grew various cereals too, notably spelt wheat and emmer, pretty hardy varieties too that could tolerate Britain's cool climate. And then there was barley as well. They had a bit of that. They also cultivated beans, peas, and brassicas, which is, I suppose, in the cabbage family, providing vegetables to the diet. With iron tools in hand, these farmers cleared woodlands and broke soil that had been untouched in earlier ages. The introduction of iron-tipped ploughs and axes made it easier to expand farmland and till heavier soils. A team of oxen pulling an iron-shod plough could turn over the earth efficiently, allowing larger fields and better harvests than in previous Bronze Age times. Farming followed the seasons. In spring, families would sow seed by hand in small plots divided by earthen banks or hedgerows. Through summer, they weeded and tended the crops, prayed to their gods for good weather. Harvest came in late summer or autumn. The community, men, women, and children alike, turned out with sickles to cut the golden fields of grain. We have an evocative account from a classical writer too, Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, who noted that after Britons reaped their grain, quote, they store the ears, cut from the stalk, in underground storehouses, and each day take as much as they need, grind it, and prepare the food. Indeed, archaeologists have found bell-shaped storage pits in Iron Age sites used to preserve grain. Once filled with dry chaff and sealed, these underground silos could keep grain edible for months, or even years, an insurance against winter shortages and poor harvests. But besides crops, livestock were central to the farming economy. Cattle were highly valued. They provided milk for dairy products, manure for fields, and muscle power to pull plows or carts. Cattle also served as a measure of wealth, and were often at the center of trade and tribute between tribes. Sheep were quite popular as well. Their wool was the main raw material for textiles, and they provided meat and milk too. Sheep's wool had become soft and spinnable by the Iron Age. Earlier in prehistory, sheep were a lot hairier, it was difficult to work with. Well, this all allowed Britons to produce warm woolen clothing, which they certainly needed. Pigs were kept in many farmsteads too, hardy and prolific animals that could forage in the woodlands. And pigs grew quickly. They were butchered for meat, especially for feasts or when other food was scarce. Goats and a few poultry animals rounded out the barnyard. Goats could browse on rough scrub and give milk, while chickens, which were introduced to Britain around the Iron Age period, were at first kept more for their novelty and eggs rather than their meat. Iron Age people basically enjoyed a diet based on what they grew and raised. A staple meal might be a thick porridge or gruel made from cracked grains cooked with water or milk. Flatbreads were common too. Simple cakes of ground grain baked on a hot stone by the hearth. Barley could be brewed into ale. Brewing residues have actually been detected at excavations, and later Roman accounts noted the barley wine of the Celts. So yeah, they were doing that for quite a long time. Dairy foods were part of the diet too. Milk, cheese, butter, they would have been made when it was possible. Although some classical commentators curiously claimed that certain British tribes did not know how to make cheese, despite the abundant milk. Meat was not eaten every day by ordinary farming families, but when an animal was slaughtered or during communal feasts, pork, beef, or mutton would be roasted or boiled in a cauldron with herbs and vegetables. Archaeologists find large bronze cauldrons and roasting spits that imply that feasting, perhaps seasonal festivals, this kind of thing, or the visit of a chief, involved hearty meat stews and barbecues that were shared by many. A special occasion, that kind of thing, you know. But one striking aspect of the Iron Age diet is apparently what they did not eat. You see, despite Britain being an island, fish and seafood are surprisingly absent from many Iron Age sites' food remains. It seems that fish was not a significant part of the daily diet, possibly due to a cultural preference, maybe even a taboo. Likewise, certain animals were avoided as food due to religious beliefs. The Roman writer Julius Caesar observed that Britons considered it contrary to divine law to eat the rabbit, the chicken, or the goose, even though they kept these animals for ritual, or perhaps even as pets. This is borne out by archaeological finds. For example, skeletons of hares and chickens have been discovered buried intact, with no butchery marks, suggesting they were treated with respect in life and death, rather than raised for consumption. And things like this tell us that spiritual values influenced eating habits. Ordinary people may have offered thanks to gods or ancestors before a meal, and they avoided consuming creatures that held a sacred status. But in hard times, and there were plenty of hard times, the Iron Age diet could be quite meagre. Poor harvests or harsh winters might force people to subsist on stored grain, and whatever could be foraged. Nuts, roots, wild fruits, that kind of thing. But in good years, a well-run farm yielded a nutritious abundance. Grains provided carbohydrates, beans and peas gave protein, and meat and dairy added fats and additional protein. Clean water came from springs and wells, and alcoholic beverages like ale or mead not only provided calories, but were safer to drink than water that might carry microbes, germs, this kind of thing. Overall, the Iron Age Britons were certainly self-sufficient farmers, and their daily meals reflected both practicality and the cycles of nature. From sowing to harvest, baking to brewing, food was a central preoccupation of life, sustaining the community and also reinforcing social bonds when people gathered to share a feast or a cup of ale after a long day's labor in the fields. From the scraps of textiles, tools, and the occasional description available, you can kind of piece together how the Iron Age Britons dressed and adorned themselves. The primary clothing material was wool from sheep, which was plentiful and could be spun and woven into sturdy fabric. Women, and sometimes men, would spend long hours spinning thread on drop spindles and weaving cloth on upright wooden looms. The woven woolen cloth could then be dyed using natural plant-based dyes. Bright colors were popular. Dyes from woad plants produced blues, madder root yielded red hues, and weld or other plants gave yellows and greens. Classical commentators noted that the Celtic peoples loved vivid patterned clothing. In fact, textile finds from Iron Age Europe, preserved in bogs and salt mines on the continent, showed checks and plaids woven into the cloth. And it is likely that Britons too wore cloaks and tunics of plaid or striped design, bringing color to the drab northern landscape. A typical outfit for a man in Iron Age Britain might consist of a tunic reaching to the knees, belted at the waist, and a pair of trousers, sometimes called braccae by the Romans, especially in cooler weather, or perhaps for riding horses. The tunic was usually made of wool and could have short sleeves. In winter, additional wool for fur cloaks were worn for warmth. Women typically wore long dresses or tunic gowns, often with an outer shawl or mantle that could be fastened with a brooch. Both men and women fastened their clothing with pins or fibulae, decorative metal clasps akin to safety pins. They're kind of like that. Many of these brooches were made of bronze or iron, and more ornate examples were inlaid with coral or enamel, indicating the wearer's status or perhaps even a regional style. Now as for footwear, that was simple but functional. People wore leather shoes or boots made from a single piece of hide sewn at the top, or wrapped leather moccasin-like footwear. Since tanning was unknown, leather from cattle or deer would be used for shoes. Since tanning was known, leather from cattle or deer would be used for shoes, belts, and straps. In wet conditions, cloaks treated with oils or grease might have offered some water resistance, and thick wool cloaks served as both coat and blanket. Notably, the climate of Iron Age Britain was damp and chilly at times, so garments had to be practical for outdoor work, and wool, with its insulating properties even when damp, was pretty much perfect for this environment. Jewelry and personal adornment added flair to Iron Age dress, especially among those of higher status. The most iconic adornment of Celtic peoples was the torque, a neck ring typically made of twisted gold, bronze, or iron. Torques, which by the way is Torc if you want to look it up, well, they were often ornately decorated at their terminals and were worn by both leaders and warriors as a sign of power and nobility. While golden torques have been found, for example in hoards buried as offerings, most everyday jewelry was simpler. Bronze bangles, iron or bronze finger rings, pendants and beads, things like that. Little stuff. Not everyone could afford a solid gold torque after all. Glass was also used to make colorful beads that were strung into necklaces and sewn onto clothing. Excavations across Britain routinely unearthed glass beads in shades of blue, red, and yellow, and that suggests that even the ordinary folk might wear a simple necklace or amulet. For pinning cloaks, disc-shaped or bow-shaped brooches called fibulae were common, and these too could be decorated with carved designs or enamel inlay by skilled metalworkers. Hair and grooming were also important aspects of appearance. Britons likely kept their hair at medium to long length, sometimes pulled back or tied. Combs made of bone or antler are frequent finds too, indicating that people groomed their hair and perhaps their beards or mustaches regularly. And indeed, some Roman observers remarked that Celtic men wore striking hairstyles. For instance, fighters would sometimes lime wash their hair, spiking it up and bleaching it to a fierce blonde color. As for facial hair, well, fashions varied there too. Many Celtic men wore prominent mustaches while keeping their chins clean-shaven, a look noted in Gaul and likely present in Britain as well. Women's hair might have been braided or pinned up with wooden or bone hairpins, and they too would use combs or oils to keep hair tidy. Body art is another intriguing aspect. Caesar wrote that the Britons dyed or painted their bodies with woad, giving a bluish coloration, especially for battle. This might not have been the everyday attire, sure, but for rituals or warfare, painting designs on skin could have been a form of symbolic adornment. Taken together, the clothing of Iron Age Britain was functional for a farming life, yet quite far from drab. It combined practicality, warm woolen fabrics and tough leather, with a bit of color and embellishment. And so when you imagine an Iron Age community gathered around at a seasonal festival, you might envision a crowd of people in brightly dyed tunics and cloaks, glinting with a bit of bronze jewelry, the firelight catching the polished gold of a chief's torque, or the crimson enamel of a brooch. Their appearance, it would have been quite striking, I think, but it also conveyed identity, status, and a cultural pride through every thread and ornament they wore. Now we must say too, moving on from the clothing and appearance section, that Iron Age Britain was not a unified kingdom, but rather a patchwork of tribes and local communities, and each one of them had their own leader and their own customs. Society was organized around kinship and tribe. People primarily identified with their extended family, their clan, and with their tribe, a larger group, often named by later Romans after their ruling clan or region. Well-known tribe names from the later Iron Age sources include the Iceni in eastern England, the Catuvellauni in the southeast, the Brigantes in the north, and many others. Though ordinary villagers would simply have thought of terms of us versus outsiders from other valleys or regions. At the local level, A community might be led by a chief or a group of elite warrior farmers. These leaders provided guidance, resolved disputes, and led the tribe in war. Some rose to become kings or queens of larger tribal federations, especially by the late Iron Age, when societies grew more hierarchical in the more populous parts of Britain. For example, historical records on the eve of the Roman conquest mention kings such as Cunliffe, by the way, that is Shakespeare's Cymbeline, in the southeast, ruling over multiple settlements. But during most of the Iron Age, leadership was likely more modest in nature. A respected elder or warrior who had a retinue of followers and influence over a certain district. These elites often lived in the larger hill forts or fortified farmsteads, where they could host feasts and display symbols of status like fine metalwork or even the occasional imported goods. The majority of the population were free commoners, farmers, herders, craft workers, and their families, who worked on their own little plots of land. Within the household, work was divided by necessity and season, rather than strictly by gender, though generally men did more of the heavy lifting, the ploughing, the herding, the warfare, while women managed domestic tasks and food preparations, textile production and child rearing. And yes, I know about Boudica before somebody jumps in and says, but the warfare, what about Boudica? Yes, I know, but we're talking in generalities here. Of course, women in Iron Age Britain likely had considerable responsibilities and court influence. Archaeological evidence, such as rich female burials in some regions, and later accounts suggest that women could own property and even lead. And, well, yes, that brings us back to the famed warrior queen Boudica, who led a revolt against the Romans in AD 60. That's just one example of a woman rising to power in a typically male-dominated field. But this was the exception, not the rule. But even before Roman times, queens like Cartimandua of the Brigantes are mentioned in Roman histories, and it indicates that some tribes accepted female rulership. Day to day, though, most Iron Age women would have exercised authority within the domestic sphere, managing food stores, the production of cloth, and the raising of children. And hey, they're all pretty crucial for a community's survival, too. Social status in Iron Age Britain was likely a spectrum rather than a rigid caste system. At the top were the tribal nobility and chieftains, distinguished by their wealth, often measured in livestock, land, and prestige goods like decorated weapons or jewelry, and by their prowess in battle and hunting. They were the ones who could afford swords of the finest craftsmanship, or wine imported from abroad to serve at banquets. Below them were the ordinary free people, farmers who owned or managed their cattle and fields, who owed loyalty or tribute to the local chief, but lived with a large degree of autonomy, at least in their daily affairs. Among these commoners would have been craft specialists as well, skilled smiths, carpenters, leather workers, maybe the odd healer, too, who while working for their living might enjoy a special status for their particular expertise in a very unique craft. And there's also evidence of a priestly or learned class, the Druids and other religious specialists. Well, we did a few videos on the Druids before, subject to a little romanticism, but we do our best to kind of tell their story in the most realistic way. Julius Caesar and other Roman writers described the Druids among the Celtic peoples as learned men who conducted religious rituals, taught the youth, and even advised chieftains. In Britain, Druidic practices were strong. In fact, Caesar noted that Gaulish Druids traced their spiritual tradition back to Britain, implying that the island was a heartland of Druidry. These Druids likely moved among tribes, conducted ceremonies at sacred sites, arbitrated disputes, and kept an oral memory of history and law. They enjoyed high status, possibly equal to or even above warriors at times, and were exempt from certain duties like warfare in exchange for their religious and legal services. So, of course, there is a bit of a line-up to enter the Druid class, if not just to get yourself out of running into the arrow fire of the Romans. Well, one cannot overlook those at the bottom of the social ladder. Slavery and servitude, that certainly did exist in Iron Age Britain. But it might not have been as systematized as in later Roman society. War captives could be made slaves, and indebted individuals might lose their freedom. Strabo, the Greek geographer, noted that slaves were one of the exports from Britain, implying that slave trading did occur, and this is likely prisoners of intertribal conflicts being captured, dragged off kicking and screaming, and then sold off. Within communities, slaves or bondsmen might have performed the hardest labor under the command of their masters. However, because most farms were family-run, slaves were probably few in number compared to the free populace, perhaps concentrated in the households of the wealthy. So it wasn't like the situation in parts of Greece where you had these huge populations of slaves, or even in Rome where, you'd find them everywhere. Not like that at all. Daily social life was woven with communal activities that reinforced bonds among people. Much work was done cooperatively. Families helped each other during harvests or joined forces to build a neighbor's new roundhouse, expecting help in return when they needed it. Seasonal festivities and feasts also brought communities together. A successful harvest might be celebrated with a communal feast in which a chief slaughtered a prized bull to roast for everyone, which is quite nice of him. Sure, the bull wasn't happy about it, though, but, it is what it is. Storytellers and bards recount ancestral tales or sing songs of heroes and gods by the fire, strengthening a kind of shared cultural identity. And hospitality, too. That was an important virtue. Travelers or members of the allied tribes would be welcomed and given food and lodging, knowing that reciprocity was expected when roles were reversed. In a world without written contracts, social cohesion relied on honor, tradition, and interpersonal ties. The rule of cool. That's pretty much it. Imagine that. Even back then, people just joining together in a community. Everyone knows each other, and people help each other out and fulfill their obligations. Sounds like a crazy idea. Maybe we can learn a little bit from the Iron Age people. But then there's the bad stuff. Conflict was part of life too. But it wasn't a constant part of life. Tribes would sometimes raid each other for cattle or prestige, and young warriors earned status through bravery in skirmishes. The construction of hill forts and the presence of weapons in many graves show that Iron Age Britons were prepared to fight when necessary. Warriors trained with spear and shield, and in some regions, elite warriors fought from chariots, light two-wheeled vehicles that could swiftly carry a fighter into battle, a practice which was famously described by Caesar during his encounters with Britons. Now, such warfare was likely seasonal or event-driven, rather than a permanent fixture. Men would farm in peacetime, and take up arms when rivalry or danger loomed. Within the tribe, though, maintaining harmony through customary law and the guidance of elders or druids was essential, since internal violence could tear apart the very fabric of society, and nobody likes it when that happens. So we can say that Iron Age British society can be imagined as a layered community of tribespeople. Hardy farmers and artisans formed the base, led by proud warriors and chieftains, and guided by the spiritual and legal council of the Druids. This social order was held together by loyalty and reciprocity. Each person, from the queen in her chariot to the bond-servant grinding grain, had a role to play in the collective, and daily life was experienced not in isolation, but as part of a close-knit group, bound by belief, blood, and mutual obligation. Although farming was the main occupation, Iron Age Britons possessed a broad range of crafts and technologies that went beyond the basic subsistence. In every village, in every district, there would be a skilled artisan or two whose work made daily life easier and more varied. Foremost among these were the metal workers. The Iron Age is defined by the use of iron, of course. Spoiler alert, that's why they call it the Iron Age. Who would have thought? And British smiths became adept at working this tough metal. In a smoky forge near the edge of a settlement, a blacksmith would heat iron blooms, smelted from iron ore in clay furnaces, and hammer them into tools and weapons. The smith made the axes that felled trees, the knives for butchering animals, the tips for plows and spears, and the swords carried by warriors. The craft was pretty demanding, too. Iron has to be wrought at very high temperatures, and the smith's skill must have been revered, perhaps even seen as a little magical by ordinary folk. Some tools and weapons from Iron Age Britain show fine workmanship, elegant sword blades with pattern welded designs, or axe heads balanced for efficient chopping. The transition from bronze to iron did not eliminate the older metal, however. Bronze casting, continued for jewelry, dress fittings, and fancy vessels. Since bronze was a lot easier to cast into more intricate shapes, it's a much softer metal. An Iron Age community might thus have both a blacksmith for iron and a bronzesmith for more finer, ornamental work. But when it comes to the real, serious business, iron is what you wanted. Now pottery, that was another important craft. Potters in the Iron Age Britain mostly worked without a potter's wheel until the later Iron Age, when the technology was introduced in the South. Early Iron Age pots were hand-formed and fired in simple kilns or open fires, producing sturdy, if plain, vessels for cooking and storage. These were the clay pots simmering stew over many a hearth, so it's all pretty important stuff. By the 1st century BCE, some regions, especially in the southeast, influenced by continental Europe, saw wheel-thrown pottery with smoother finishes and new forms like tall jars and drinking cups. Pottery styles varied by region. Archaeologists can often tell from the fabric and shape of a pot where it came from, whether that was East Anglia or Cornwall, whichever one. And this hints that pots were not only made locally, but sometimes traded across distances. Textile production, though a domestic task, was also a skilled craft. Weaving a good, tight cloth on a loom required practice, not to mention knowledge of patterns. Spinners knew which sheep's wool made the softest yarn, and dyers knew which bark or flower would produce a lasting color. So while every homestead produced textiles for its own use, There may have been individuals particularly known for producing finer or even specialty fabrics of the day, perhaps exchanging them for other goods. Leatherworking was similarly essential, from tanning hides to stitching shoes, belts, and water skins. The tools of these trades, bone needles, metal shears, hide scrapers, are pretty common finds, and they speak to a well-developed tradition of handicrafts. Trade and exchange in Iron Age Britain also took many forms. Within the community, barter was the norm. A farmer might swap a sack of grain for a new pot or a metal knife, this kind of thing. Regional markets or fairs likely took place at central locations, perhaps at a hill fort or a sacred site, or on certain festival days, where people from outlying areas came together. Here they could trade livestock, grain from the recent harvest, cloth, and crafted items. Such gatherings would also be social events, strengthening ties between villages and tribes. Long-distance trade connected Iron Age Britain to the wider European world. Despite being across the sea from the continent, Britons were not as isolated as you might think. As early as the Bronze Age, they had exported tin, a vital ingredient in bronze from Cornwall. In the Iron Age, archaeological discoveries show an influx of certain goods from abroad. For example, Mediterranean pottery and glass beads have been found in Iron Age contexts, particularly in southern Britain. Perhaps the most celebrated import was wine. Amphorae, that is, large pottery jars, from Gaul containing wine have been found at sites of Iron Age chiefs, indicating that the elite enjoyed the taste. In exchange, Britain exported raw materials and unique products. Strabo, in the early 1st century, recorded that Britain yields, quote, grain, cattle, gold, silver, and iron, and exports hides, dogs, and slaves, the dogs likely being the famous British hounds who were praised for hunting. Well, this list reveals the British communities mined metals like tin in the southwest and iron in various areas, and that they sometimes traded people captured in war as slaves. The mention of dogs suggests that even specialties like hunting dogs were commodities that could be exchanged with continental neighbors, and they no doubt were. In the later Iron Age, a century or two before the Roman conquest, the economy grew more sophisticated in certain regions. The use of coinage began to spread in the southeast of Britain. At first, these were gold and silver coins, copied from Gaulish designs around the 2nd century BCE, often used by elites for high-value transactions or ceremonial gifts. But by the 1st century BCE, local kings were minting their own coins, stamped with symbols or names. For instance, the coins of King Conobelinus have been found in Camalodunum, that is a modern-day Colchester. These coins, though limited to certain areas, signal an evolving market economy and the rise of the oppida, proto-urban centers that doubled as trading hubs and power centers. Still, for the average villager in Iron Age Britain, daily transactions remained face-to-face exchanges of goods and labors. Transport for trade relied on both overland and river routes. People traveled on foot, or using carts drawn by oxen or ponies along dirt trackways that crisscrossed the island. Rivers like the Thames, Trent, or Severn were crucial arteries for moving goods. Log boats or simple sailboats could carry heavy loads of salt, ingots, or pottery along these waterways. Coastal seafaring also occurred. Communities near the sea had boats capable of crossing short distances, facilitating trade with Gaul, or between different parts of Britain. Some archaeologists believe that certain coastal settlements, like Hengistbury Head on the south coast, functioned as trading ports, where continental traders exchanged goods with the Britons. In crafting and trading, The people of Iron Age Britain demonstrated ingenuity and quite a bit of connectivity. They built what they needed, from everyday pots to elaborate gold torques. Remember torques being that kind of necklace, kind of like a horseshoe sort of thing. And they were also eager to acquire novel goods from distant lands when they were available. The flow of materials and ideas through trade brought innovation, such as the potter's wheel or new artistic motifs, and they also helped create a vibrant culture that was distinctly British Celtic, yet in conversation with the wider Celtic world of Iron Age Europe. For the ordinary person, this meant that a humble roundhouse could contain items of surprisingly far-flung origin, a glass bead perhaps made in the Mediterranean, or a piece of coral set in a brooch, or a jar of wine opened for a rare celebratory feast. Such connections made daily life in Iron Age Britain richer and more varied than one might expect for a, quote, primitive society. Of course, religion and spirituality touched every aspect of Iron Age life, from the household hearth to the tribal assembly. The people of Iron Age Britain did not leave written myths or scriptures, which is quite a shame, but archaeological evidence and contemporary writings give us a few glimpses of what their spiritual world was actually like, and we can certainly say it was a world suffused with the sacred. The divine was seen in natural places like groves, springs, rivers, even in the very earth that yielded their crops. The Britons were polytheistic, worshipping a multitude of gods and goddesses, many of them tied to forces of nature or tribal ancestors. Names of specific deities in Iron Age Britain are pretty scant. Later Roman records do mention a few, often equating them with Roman gods, but you know, there's only so much we can take that as gospel from the Romans. But it is likely that they had deities of sky and thunder, fertility and harvest, of war and of healing, much like their Celtic kin in Gaul and Ireland. One key institution in the Iron Age British religion was that class of druids. They were essentially learned priests, prophets, and judges. They memorized law, performed rituals, and acted as intermediaries between the people and the gods. Now, when Julius Caesar came along observing the Celts, he wrote that the doctrine of the Druids included belief in the immortality of the soul and reincarnation, a belief that likely gave warriors courage, since death was not seen as the end, but rather a new beginning, more of a bridge. Britain in particular was famed for its Druids. The island was considered by some Romans as a spiritual center for Druidic teaching. Druids probably led communal ceremonies at certain times of the year, such as planting and harvest, solstices, and other significant seasonal turning points. But they also presided over sacrifices, and yes, sacrifice was a cornerstone of Iron Age ritual practice. Offerings to the gods to ensure fertility, victory, or prosperity. Pretty normal human concerns. These offerings could range all the way from food and crafts to animal sacrifices, and yes, in some cases, human sacrifices. Archaeology provides pretty dramatic evidence of these practices. Across Britain, many weapons and treasures have been unearthed in rivers, bogs, and lakes, items carefully deposited as gifts to the divine powers. The Thames, for example, that is, if you don't know, the river that flows through London, yielded the beautiful Battersea shield and the Waterloo helmet, exquisitely crafted bronze armaments that were likely offered to river gods as ceremonial votives. Such objects were not casually lost. They appeared deliberately placed in watery depths, a pattern repeated at many sites. On dry land, special pits or wells sometimes contained ritually placed goods, pottery vessels, animal bones, and even chariots or human skulls. One famous find at Linkerrick Buck in Anglesey uncovered an array of offerings, including swords twisted out of shape, perhaps done so ritually before being offered. They've also found cauldrons and slave chains, all thrown into a lake that presumably had a sacred status. Human sacrifice in Iron Age Britain is a subject of debate, but classical sources insist it occurred, and some archaeological finds do support it. Caesar wrote that the Gauls, and by implication the Britons, built giant wicker figures filled with living humans and burned them as offerings to the gods. Now that's a pretty sensational account. It might be a half-truth. It might be complete propaganda. We don't quite know. More concrete, though, is the evidence of so-called bog bodies. In the peat bogs of northwestern Europe, including the British Isles, several Iron Age bodies have been discovered in exceptional preservation, often showing signs of violent death. Lindoman, found in a Cheshire bog, is a famous example dating to roughly the 1st century CE. This unfortunate man appears to have been clubbed on the head, strangled, and had his throat cut. Not sure in what order, but either way, not good. An overkill pattern, that's for sure, but it suggests a ritual killing rather than an ordinary murder. I mean, why go to all the trouble, right? He was then placed in the bog, a waterlogged liminal place, perhaps as an offering to the gods or spirits of the land. Such finds hint that at times of great importance, perhaps to avert disaster or during crises, the Britons may have sacrificed a human, possibly a high-status individual, or maybe even a criminal, to appease the divine forces. However, these practices would have been extraordinary rather than the routine. Everyday religious life more often involved simpler offerings or prayers. Much of Iron Age religion likely took place under the open sky or in forest sanctuaries. Unlike the classical world, Iron Age Britons did not typically build large temples in stone. Those had only come around later under Roman influence. Instead, sacred spaces were often natural. A clearing in the oak woods, a hilltop, a spring whose clear water seemed to be healing. There is evidence of some constructed shrines. For example, small wooden shrines or sanctuaries identified at a few sites. But these were pretty modest. The act of worship might involve lighting a ritual fire, pouring out a libation of mead or ale to the earth, or casting valuable objects into a holy lake. The druids or tribal elders might lead chants or prayers. Ordinary people surely had household devotions too. A family might toss a bit of bread or beer into the hearth fire as an offering to household spirits or ancestors, just in case they were watching. And in some Iron Age houses, archaeologists have found animal bones, or special objects buried in post holes and under thresholds, which could represent foundation offerings to bless the home. Death and burial customs also reflect their beliefs. Intriguingly, for much of the Iron Age, the Britons did not practice the elaborate burials with grave goods seen in the earlier Bronze Age or later Anglo-Saxon times. Instead, they often followed excarnation, which, if you're not familiar with the term, it basically means exposing the dead to decompose naturally, perhaps on platforms or out in the open, and then after the birds and insects had picked it clean, they would gather up the bones. In some settlements, human bones or partial skeletons have been found placed in pits or ditches among the living areas, and this suggests a practice of keeping ancestors physically present in the community, or returning them to the earth in a way integrated with daily life. Where formal burials do occur, they tend to be either very simple, a crouched inhumation, with maybe a pot or nothing at all, or in certain regions, dramatically grandiose. For example, in East Yorkshire, land of the Parisi tribe, nobles were interred in large burial mounds accompanied by chariots, horses, and fine goods. The so-called chariot burials, which indicate a belief in an afterlife where status and possessions still mattered. The diversity of burial rites across Iron Age Britain, from bones scattered in settlements to warrior chieftains buried in their chariots, it shows that there was no single correct way to honor the dead. Each community had its own customs, shaped by tradition and spiritual belief. Of course, religion in daily life was not confined to big ceremonies. A farmer might whisper a prayer to the earth goddess while planting seeds, or wear a small talisman for luck. A warrior might dedicate his victory by hanging the enemy's taken weapons or even their skull in a sacred tree by a shrine. But communities did gather at certain times of the year, possibly at Samhain, that is summer's end around November, or Beltane, springs beginning in May, festivals known in the later Celtic calendars to mark seasonal changes with ritual feasting and bonfires. These would reinforce community bonds and renew the people's connection with the divine cycle of nature. Through these acts, Iron Age Britain sought to ensure the balance of their world, that the sun would return stronger after the winter, the cows would be healthy, and that their warriors would have courage to win the day, and ultimately that the favor of the gods would rest on their fields and families. And there you have it. I'm sure you'll agree that it was not as primitive as you might have thought. Or maybe you already knew it wasn't primitive. I don't know. In any case, it's certainly different to what the Romans sort of had in mind with it. You know, when you read about these areas, the Romans mention a few little things in a positive light, but they don't quite tell the whole story. Of course, later on, when we have a look through archaeology and all the rest, well, we certainly find that, no, they were not primitive savages in that sense. But then again, for the Romans, anything that was not Roman, or at least Greek in its expression, was indeed just a form of savagery. And we can't blame the Romans for seeing things through their own eyes. They had their own world view. And it's good that we have it, because it's kind of a counterbalance. It tells a different kind of the story. Anyway. Now let me thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carey, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfidnir, Alexander. Oh, where am I? There I am. Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Guga Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, KTB, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aidan, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun 101, Brandy, Pestian, Stevie, Jessica, Scott, Gale, Emily, Jade, Jake, Demon's Toe, Mason, John, Magenta, Dumpster, Tracy, Mossy Frog, Catherine, Ezio's Art, Autumn, Monica, Jennifer, White Rags, Gertrude, Rose, Formal Horse, and Sandpiper. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And that's it for me for now. Thank you for joining me. and I will see you whenever you feel like coming back and visiting us. Good night for now, and farewell.